Some time ago, I began the series, and actually it began almost in a lark in my mind. It was funny. I remember I was telling you I was watching America's Most Wanted. I kind of like to watch that, and I watched Bad Boys on Saturday night, and which is cops, which is those two have been on for a long, long time. And somewhere during the course of that night, I was thinking, Satan's got a most wanted list, and then I began to formulate into a sermon and into a message for Satan's most wanted. And it was kind of humorous to me at first, and then as I thought about it and got into it, I said, there's a lot of truth in this, as I was thinking about developing that first sermon message. And thinking, I said, well, I'll just start with something, and I said, well, Elijah came to my mind. Well, actually, as I look back now, I kind of look at that as like there is more to it than just a lark, because as I was developing this series, and to me, I believe that we can be able to look at the series, and it's going to play a greater role in a warning message as we get closer and closer to the return of Christ. And I hope you feel the same way too. I know those who are here have heard, hopefully you've heard all the four we've done so far. And actually, I thought I was finished in this series, but all tie in together. I really did. In fact, the last one I did, it was called the Endtime Generation. It seemed all these worked in together as a message for an end-time generation and how they all fit for God giving us a warning message. So this week as I was in here, in fact in here yesterday, I was working on some of the lighting for the new studio and working on a sermon message for today. And I like to come in here when it is quiet, by the way, and I usually do that during the week. And I'll turn this little backlight on, and I'll sit and I'll just meditate with the light on and looking at God and looking for direction and guidance. Sometimes I'll put on that music like you've heard before services today. So as I was working on a sermon message, it was in a total different area, and the thought of me came to me that I want to talk about today. And I don't want to give you the person's name yet, because this one actually follows up on the end time generation. And I'm going to explain to you what I mean by that in just a second. The very first one I did in this series of Satan's Most Wanted was Elijah. And I went with Elijah, showing how Elijah was a type of the two witnesses and how things were going to come to play at the end time. The next one that ties in, because they all fit neatly together, is God's message gives us a warning for an end time. So the next one we went to was a type of Christ, a type of Jesus, which was Moses. Remember how Moses was the type, that he was meek and he was humble and he brought the people out of bondage. But Jesus Christ was the type. When Jesus Christ came the first time, he took us out of bondage by overcoming sin. The second coming of Jesus Christ is the type of Christ, which is typified in type by Joshua. All right, with Joshua, we're talking about bringing them into the promised land. He was a warrior type. And he had to overcome the kingdoms that were in the promised land, just like Jesus Christ is coming back to overcome the kingdoms of this earth. So he was a type. So here I'm looking at it, so well, all these things fit together to one goal. And the goal was to give us an example of what it would be like and what to look forward, projecting ahead for you and I, because as we went through the message the last time, the end time generation, that God was going to use that generation, which will encompass all of it all at one time. We're coming out of bondage at the end time. We're going into the promised land at the end time. We have the return of Christ, and you have the two witnesses. So all these fit together. And honestly, at the time, I said, well, that series is finished. In fact, when I gave Jeff the title today, he said, oh, well, I'll have to go back and remove it because the end time generation was the last one. I said, no, actually, it fits in perfectly, because this is the last one. Now, I may be back here next week saying, oh, there's one more. There's one more. But I'm going to share this one with you, and you'll understand why. Because here's the problem if we just left it with the end-time generation. All those were examples for us. The problem is, where we left off is, we didn't cover going into the tribulation. So we didn't cover none of that. We know about what's going to happen. We know we're going to come out of it. But there's no type warning us on how to deal with and prepare to go into the tribulation. So there was one more type that God actually had. See, and all these characters were types for you and I. They actually lived an entire life. And God has recorded that here for you and I, so that when it happens, we can look back and say, how do we deal with this? God says, well, flip back. I showed you how. Any idea who? The type. He's there. Now, when those who get this on tape, they'll already know because the title will be on the tape. So that's unfair to you all. But today I want to talk about Satan's most wanted. The story of Joseph. The story of Joseph. I want to talk about that today. Now, I'm going to give you a long lead-in and build up to Joseph to give you some examples of what it is that we're going to be going through. There's a quote I'm going to give you for you. And this was, I think it was recorded by Jerry Rice. I could be wrong, and I don't know if he got it from someone else, but when I wrote this down, I got it from a quote. It says this: "Today I will do what others won't, so that tomorrow I can accomplish what others can't." Now that caught my attention. I've been thinking about that. So, wow, that's pretty interesting. I will do today what others won't. Now, we work together with a couple of guys in the church, and my goal is this: if they can do it, we can learn it. We may not be as good as they are. We may not be as fast as they are. In other words, if God will give them the talent, then we can do it too. Now, what this quote says, if they don't do it, if we're doing it today, that means we're in a better shape to do tomorrow what they haven't accomplished yet. Can't accomplish. Now, that's partially true, but that's a little vain to some degree. So I wanted to change that and rephrase it just a little bit and put it in context of how God would appreciate what we're doing. And I put it like this: to do extraordinary tasks, God grants special gifts and talents to accomplish that task. All right? Here the glory goes to God, not to the individual. Whereas with that quote that I read earlier, is this person say that I'm great because I'm doing this today, and I'm going to be better than they are tomorrow because of what I'm doing today. In one sense of the word, that's true what he's saying. But here in God's realm, we need to understand something. We can't do nothing of ourselves. So what we have to do is focus on what God says that we're doing. All right? And give him the glory. If we can't do that, then he can't use us. I don't care how gifted and how talented you are. If you, in the realm of trusting God as a believer, if you don't give the glory to God, you're in trouble. You take it upon yourself. And that was one of the stories of Moses. So that when Jesus Christ was on this earth, he looks back at Moses. And that's why he could not let Moses go into that promised land. Because he knew that Moses was the type of who he was going to be. That at any time he ever compromised, took the glory to himself and didn't give it to his father, he would have lost salvation and you and I would have been condemned. So Moses was held to that extreme. Remember when he said, must we fetch water from this rock? And he hit it twice. Well, he didn't go to the promised land because of that. That one thing kept him out. Now, Jesus knew that example. So with you and I, the greater the task that God has for you, the greater the responsibility for you to be like he is. Now, that makes sense. Joseph gives us a type of moving and preparing us, of refining our silver, because you see, we are the end time generation, and I believe we are. If it's 50 years from down the road, you say, well, Tom was wrong. He's gone, we're still here. But when you look around the rest of the world, what's going on today, I don't know how that can possibly be. I honestly believe we are the end time generation when you look at what's going on. So let me read what I rephrased. To do extraordinary tasks. Now, let me break it down. The end time generation is going to be required to do an extraordinary task. You realize that? We're going to have to hold fast at all cost under the most extreme, difficult time the world has ever known. I don't know that we get that fully fixed in our heads. We will have to hold fast at an end time, at the most difficult time this world has ever seen. And there will never be another time like it. That means we're going to have to do an extraordinary work. I went on to say that God grants special gifts and talents to accomplish that task. So that we are confident that if we hold fast to that God is going to give us the gifts and the talents to accomplish that task. Now, I can put on a little phrase in here, and let's re-rank that at the very end, if we hold fast and trust Him. I was talking to a gentleman yesterday who's actually in a church, and I'm sure I won't embarrass, I won't mention his name. He was explaining to me about losing his work. And I remember a few months back, it came to us, and man, the whole world is just like, the whole world's over. What am I going to do? I lost my job. Making high-paying money. Been there for a long time, but knew about the Sabbath. Couldn't make the switch. Couldn't step out because, like, man, what I'm going to do, this is all I know. Well, sometimes when God wants you into His church, He will make the decision for you, and before you know it, you're out. And I told him back then when we talked, I said, if you read 1 Peter 5, God says, after you have suffered a while, in other words, He's going to get you to refocus your values on where you stand. God will strengthen you. Well, I've seen now His strength coming in. And now, all of a sudden, those that if He would have just held in, He could have gone back to work if He'd have gave up the Sabbath. He could have gone right back to work. Other companies. All the companies now have been laying everybody off. And it was interesting that it came up and said, it's interesting that you bring this up because had you made the decision to go back and trust your future to the job and forsake the Sabbath, you would have lost it anyway. And possibly your salvation. Now, that's just one example. All of us are being forced to make decisions. And if you haven't yet, you will. I guarantee you what's coming down the pipe is not looking good for this country. When you turn your back on Israel, when you turn your back on God's people, you are going against the scripture where God says, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. When we turn our back on our brother, God says we're going to bring curses on ourselves, and I'm telling you, it's coming, and we better get ready for it. I listen to people who think that this new movement that's going afoot is going to save us. Hogwash. It will not. And I told somebody this week, I said, I hear what you're saying, and I agree with what they're trying to accomplish. It's not going to work. I believe we have reached the phase where God says, I will turn them over to reprobate minds. That means that no matter what you do, will not be accomplished because you eventually are fighting against the very will of God without ever realizing it. Never before have I seen where a government just ignores the majority of the people and says, I will do it anyway. I hope we realize what's going on here. And people say, okay, well then the Democrats are going out, the Republicans are going to come back in. Hogwash again. They will not. I hope we understand that. It's not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's not a green movement or a tea movement. It's good and evil. We got to get that in our minds, brethren. We're at the end time. It isn't about which party going to get it right. I'm telling you, everyone are corrupt. Every one of them. And I'm going to tell you something else. It isn't white and it isn't black. We could stick a yellow person in the president's office, and if they're doing evil, it's going to bring evil on his nation. God's people have to think at right and wrong. And where we stand today, I believe God has now turned us over to reprobate minds. Because the decisions that are being made from even people you seem to respect make absolutely no sense. I hope you're seeing that. The repercussions of what's going on today are going to be felt for a long time to come. I believe we are beginning to go into the time of lean. I believe we've had some time of of prosperity. Where do you stand and how do you deal with this? Joseph tells us. And that's why I'm focusing on that now. Because you see, all those things we covered tells us what's going to happen, how it's supposed to happen, but it doesn't tell us how we fit into that, does it? Joseph does. And that's why I guess God blessed the understanding of bringing him in last, where I thought I was finished, that series, but I wasn't. Because it didn't tell us what we need to do to change, to be like he is, to do what he wants us to do. All right? So that was a long lead-in, about a 16-minute lead-in to talk about Joseph. So now let's go and take a look at this. Let's do a little more lead-in before I actually get into Joseph to talk about character. Let's go to, I'm going to start in Exodus 31. Exodus chapter 31. Exodus chapter 31 is talking about the building of the tabernacle of God. God had just spent 7 chapters, 7 entire chapters telling Moses how to build his tabernacle. He covered every possible angle there was. Who was to serve in it? What kind of food they're supposed to have there? Who's going to be in there? How are they going to build it? How's it going to be laid out? And I thought it was kind of ironic, and I never thought it until I looked at it this morning. It took 7 chapters. 7. Kind of like the completion, like God's completion is 7. It's funny how they broke the chapters down. It covers the 7 chapters on building his tabernacle. I want to pick it up in chapter 31, verse 1. The Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, See, I have called by name Bezaleel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God. Now that's interesting in itself. I have filled him with the Spirit of God. Now, I find that quite interesting because, we've always been told that in the Old Testament they had the Spirit of God dwelling with them, but they didn't, leading them, but they didn't have it in them. Right? That ain't true. The difference is they didn't have the Spirit of the Father, but they had the Spirit in the Old Testament. It says, and it filled him. So we had a sermon on that. I forgot the name of it. I had to go back and find the name of it where we showed how difference is. But this man was filled with the Spirit of God. Remember, you can't put new wine in old wineskins. Right? The New Testament tells us that. That means that if God's going to use you and fill you with His Spirit, your character can't be the way it was. All right? God had a special task and a special mission, just like He does for the end-time generation. That special task and that mission is very important to us. That means that our wineskin, our character has to change to be able to be filled with the Holy Spirit. It says, I have filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom and in understanding and in knowledge in all manner of workmanship, to design skillful works, to work in gold and silver and in bronze, and in cutting stones to set them, and in carving timber, to work in all manner of workmanship. And behold, I have given him Oholiab, the son of Ahimaach, in the tribe of Dan, and in the hearts of all the wise-hearted have I put wisdom, that they may make all that I have commanded thee. Now, why go here? We're talking about an end-time generation. It's because God establishes within individuals the ability to do His work. He has created in these men the power to be able to do what He needs done. And He put it in them. Why? Because their hearts were proper. So for you and I to do this end-time work, we're going to have a proper heart. Our goal and our desire is going to have to be focused on Him. That means that you're going to have to be diligent, dedicated, serving God with all your heart. It's like you refocus your everything you do to do what? Like, why do you have a job? Well, to pay my family. No. You have the job so that you can serve God and take care of your family. See, if you don't work, you don't eat. So God blesses you. In other words, your thought must be everything that God's given you to do is to be able to serve Him, and the rest comes in place by being blessed because you've done that. Your focus is going to have to change. Everybody, I'm going to tell you, everybody in this room and everybody hears this tape, before this is all over, you're going to have to learn to do without. Without what? Without a lot. because things are not going to be good for 3.5 years. You don't go 3.5 years of drought and problems without it affecting every single person on the face of this earth. Now, when we look at the end time, you can see what's coming. Sometimes you go through what you're going through today and you don't have any idea why. For those of you who know the story of Joseph, he went through a lot. That's what I'm talking about, Joseph. He didn't know why. He didn't have a clue. But you might have, God would say, well, you're going to go through this because you're going to live a type. And this is going to come down 4,000 years later to those people down here. That's why you're going through this today. What do you think that would have been like? 4,000 years down the road, this is why you're doing this today. But that's part of the reason that God gives us this now. It was dual purpose. Of course, it was for them then. It's also for us now. Now, let's go on and see what he says here. And the tabernacle of the congregation, of the ark of the testimony, and the mercy seat that's therein, and the furniture of the tabernacle, and the table of its furniture, and the pure lampstand with all its furniture. And they go through and he's building and building. In verse 11 it says, and the anointing of the oil, the sweet incense for the holy place, according to all that I have commanded you, shall they do. So God was able to instill within these individuals the task he needed to build what he did. I read this and I think about the craftsman. You talk about where you're going to meet, one day in the kingdom we're going to meet Elijah, we're going to meet all these people. And they talk about, well, we're going to see the Ark of the Covenant one day. How about the guy who built it? What do you think the glory of God is going to give that individual? That he stood the ability to do this. Now, there's something that we miss when we read over this, that his heart wasn't puffed up in vain because God couldn't use him if he was. Because he was filled with the Holy Spirit, it said. So the ability for him to be able to accomplish that kept him humble enough to do the work where God can put his Spirit in there. If you and I, God gives us gifts and talents, and we get so puffed up, then he can't use us because we get in the way. You see my point? In other words, we are our own worst enemies. That God has a special task for us as an end-time generation. So what he's trying to do is refine us so that he can put the talent in us to use for his work. Joseph went through a lifetime of refining for a very specific purpose. I believe today that God's people are going through that same refining. I'll talk to people and they don't have any idea why they're going through what they're going through. And you see them going through mess and problems, and before you know it, things turn around and it settles down, and I see a difference in character in those individuals. I've seen it in myself over the years. When you think you're doing real well, or you don't realize the humility is gone and ego set in, and you're back on your feet, and sat down again. It's like, man, what in the world happened? All right, let's move on. All right, I want to pick it up now. Acts 19, Acts chapter 19. We're going to come to Joseph in just a few more minutes, but I wanted to show you a few things, tying that into us, using Joseph's example, and talking about us at an end time. Chapter 19. Reading verse 11. And God wrought special miracles by the hands of Paul. What would it be like if you could walk out of this room, touch a cloth, put some oil on it, send it to somebody, and the lame walks and the sick are healed? Can we handle that? Or would that affect our psychic, so to speak, our ego, so that God says, well, look, there he goes again. Every time I give this person some special talent, they go off the deep end, and before you know it, they're in trouble spiritually, and I got to pull them back. I honestly believe that God goes and grants us the trials, which are blessings, to humble us so that when he wants to use us, we don't go off the deep end. Now, Paul was one of those special individuals that God gave special talents, gifts, visions, healings. Now look what he says. Let's go to 2 Corinthians 12. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 6. It says, For though I would desire to glory, talking about reading up to this chapter, all the things that God had done for him. He said, I've seen things that's not even lawful to talk about. His mind went to the third heavens. He was dealt with Christ one-on-one. He was taught by Jesus by himself. he goes on to say now, but though I would desire the glory, I shall not be a fool. Paul come to the understanding that, you know what, yeah, I can do this, but if I take the glory for it and I want to boast about what's going on, look, I'm just a fool because I've just destroyed everything God's built in me. And you and I need to get to that. And sometimes he's got to tear us down, got to destroy us, take everything to evaluate what's important in our life so that he can fill us up with the Holy Spirit and use us. And sometimes it takes more than once because we got hard heads. And you'll go through that next test. And you'll go for a while and you'll fail again. Pull you back down again. And each time he strengthens you to evaluate what's really important. I was telling people right before church, I said, one thing, God willing, I'll never say again. I'm not afraid of him. What can they do to me? Well, when God takes his hands off you in your protection, they can do a lot. Take a look at Job. When God says, okay, I'll take my hands off of him, just don't take his life. Take a look at Job. You think you can do things on your own. If God isn't with you, you are in trouble. All right, verse 6. It says, shall I be a fool? For I will say the truth, but for now I will bear, lest any man should think of me above that which he sees me, or that he hears of me, lest I should be exalted above measure, and through the abundance of the revelations there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan. God sent somebody from Satan to give him a problem to keep him humble, so that God could use him. In other words, God's going to keep us, if he's going to get us in his kingdom, he's going to do whatever he has to keep you in the mindset to get you to his kingdom. And if you can't get yourself under control, two things are going to happen. God's going to do it, or he's going to get rid of you. What a mess to be in either case. If you've been called and you're learning the truth, man, just sit down and say, yes, Lord. And focus on change. You know, Billy Graham had a song he used for his everything he had, just as I am. Remember, I come to you just as I am. Well, that might be true when he calls you, but it's not true the day after. It's not true the day after that either. Because from the day he calls you, he knows where you are and he wants you to change. And then he starts refining you to be his character. So you just can't go to God in 2 years and say, look, I'm just as I am. God says you're going to change or you're not going to be here. So there's an example of Paul. So God had a special mission for him, so he had to change him, and he had to find a way to keep him humble. Now let's go back one more example. Let's go to Genesis chapter 37. Chapter 37, verse 3. Oh, I'm in Exodus. Hang a second. Genesis 37. Genesis 37, I'll begin in verse 3. It says, now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm in Genesis. I didn't want to go there yet. That's Joseph. I do want to give you one more example before I go there. You can save this spot here, because we'll come back to it. I'm going to give you one more example of Genesis 18. Genesis chapter 18. I said, how did I jump into Joseph so quick? So quick, it's almost been halfway over. All right, Genesis 18, verse 17. It says, for the Lord said, and this is when he was talking about what it's going to do with Sodom and Gomorrah and what's going to happen with Lot. And the Lord says, shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and a mighty nation, and all the nations on the earth shall be blessed in him? For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do what is righteous and justice. And the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he had spoken of him. See, Abraham had to come to a point in his life where God can use him in a very special way. However, at this point, he was not yet ready. But he knew his heart was right. He knew he was going to bring him to that stage, but he had to be tried. He had to be refined. Now, how do we know he wasn't yet ready? Well, let's just turn a chapter or two over. Look at Genesis chapter 20. And Abraham, verse 1, journeyed from there, and he went to the Negev, and he dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned near Gerar. And Abram said of Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, the king of Gerar, sent, and he took Sarah. Now, this is after God told, I know he's going to do whatever However, he gets down a little bit further. He fears for his life through his journey. Says, well, they're going to look at Sarah. She's a beautiful woman. They might kill me because of her, because she's my wife. So you just tell them she's my sister. So the king finds out his sister, comes, takes his wife, and brings him back to the palace. Fortunately, God intervenes and said, listen, what you've done, you've took that man's wife, sent her back. God intervened. So see, Abraham wasn't yet ready. I don't want to be in that. I would have not liked to have been around that household when she got back. Because I guarantee you, it couldn't have been pretty. Just got rid of his wife to protect his own life. Now, there's the father of the faithful, right? Abraham learned from that. He understood his points that he had to change. Because you see, just a couple more chapters later, let's go to Genesis 22. You know the story. We had to take his only son. And he waited all those years, all his life, for his son. And he took his son, and I'm going to begin in verse 12. And he says, lay not your hand upon the lad, neither do you anything upon him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have withheld your son, your only son. In other words, God had a special purpose for Abraham. He had to give us the character of the Father, that the Father was willing to lay down his only Son, Jesus Christ, to die for us. And he had to have a person who had that character, that type, inside of him, so that God can use him to show us the character of the Father, what the Father was going to have to give up. So he took a man who waited his whole life, 100 years of just about, to get a son, and then had to give him up and trust God. See, that's what Jesus Christ would have to do when he came. He would have to trust that when he laid his life down, that he would be with his Father. What special task does God have for you at the end time? Now, that's a fair question. You probably don't know yet. I don't know in my life either. I do know one thing from looking at all the examples, from looking at the story of Joseph that we're about to cover now. God has a special mission for each one of us. I'm saying every person who's been called, who's going to be a part of that end-time generation, has a special purpose in their life. If you don't believe that, what are you doing? Why else would you be here? This is not a social club. You have been called to do a work. That's what I meant a little while ago when I thought when you go to your job, it's not to support just your home, because God will do that. It's to do a job. It's to serve God. If you serve him first, he will bless you. Your home will be cared for. You will be provided for, because you put your focus in him. And if you're doing it any other way, you got to get balanced. You got to get back and focus. It's got to be with him first. And that means it's going to be putting you to test and to try. So that when that final task comes, wherever that task is, it may be to help save your family. That innumerable multitude that's going to come out of the tribulation. That you've counted the cost and you've been tried and you've lost it. And you've gotten back on your feet. I talked to a man last night. We went and picked up some sandwiches for working here. Was doing some electrical work. And as he was preparing it, in fact, they were shut down. So I went over to get a trout sandwich, and he was actually closed. And he said, no, he's like, he kicks the grease back on. He said, I'll make you sandwiches. And I thought that was so nice of him. And so while he's doing it, we had time to talk. And the man owned a steak and a lobster house down in the French Quarter before Hurricane Katrina. And they had some kind of damage, and there was water got into it, and he didn't have enough insurance, and he lost his home. And he lost everything he had, he said. He says, and 4 years later, I got this little, like a little hole in the wall. He's got a kitchen area inside of a filling station. And you know what he told me? He says, I always believed that if you could do it once, you could do it again. I said, here's a man who doesn't understand the truth and the Sabbath or anything else, but he has the hope to see the fruits that God can work with you. I said, well, that's interesting, because that's what happened with Job. Remember, God took everything away, and he built it back. And I've always felt that. If you can accomplish it once, God can do it again. The second time, God willing, it would be better because your focus is different. Your priority is different. What you thought was important isn't important anymore because you've already lost it. And you know what it's like to go without. You know what it's like to be out, down and out and have nothing. You know, I remember times when I just had food enough to give at work, and I would take half of the food so I'd have food at night because I didn't have any money, and just struggle through. And you know, I look back now, those were good times. I learned a lot. I was closer to God at that particular time. I seen things and learned things back then I never understood when I was doing real well and making lots of money. And I was happier than ever. That's where we're going to come to. That's the point we're going to get to when we look like the apostles when they beat him and they said, now don't go out there and mention that Jesus Christ anymore. And they beat him with stripes and they turned him loose from prison. They went out singing, praising God, and right back where they were the day before talking about Jesus Christ. That's the focus you and I are going to get to if we're not there now, before the end time comes. Now, I need to move on now to get into Joseph. I wanted to give you all this background because you see, if we don't understand the background of Joseph, we won't understand the mission for us today. All right, now let's go to Genesis 37. I'm going to skip around the story of Joseph because it's kind of lengthy and there's a lot of things in it, but I want to cover just a few specific points of Joseph. Genesis 37, verse 3, that's where we were. It says, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a great coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all their brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. So we see the friction that was beginning to develop at a very young age for Joseph. And if that wasn't enough, insult comes to injury. Verse 5. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it to his brethren, and they hated him yet even more. And the dream was, and he said, hear, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamt. For behold, you were binding heavens, binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and behold, your sheaves stood around about and made obeisance to my sheaf. Now, the brothers don't like him already. So now this young whippersnapper comes up and says, hey, I just had a dream, and all you guys are going to be bowing down to me. That's what he just told them. They don't like him already. So now, what we don't know, how he told them. Arrogance? I don't know. Kind of seemed like it could be. Of course, you'd have to read into it. We don't know. But we do know he was bold enough to say, hey, listen, I had this dream. In whatever fashion he told them, they hated him even more. Now, we pick up the story again, verse 8. So his brother said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. Verse 9. Now, it wasn't enough. Here comes another one. And he dreamed yet another dream. And he told it to his brethren and said, behold, I have dreamed a dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made themselves obeisant to me. Now, everything's bowing down to him. In other words, the whole earth, everything around it, is bowing down to him. Now, this is even worse than the first one. So he told it to his father and his brother, and his father rebuked him and said unto him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and my mother and your brother indeed come and bow down ourselves to you on the earth? And we can look back and say, yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. Now, Joseph didn't understand what was going on. All he knows is he has this dream. You know, he might have been pretty cocky about it. Maybe he said it very humbly. No matter how he said it, they hated him. All right, here we go. Let's pick it up now. And let's start in verse 12. So the brethren went to feed the father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, do not your brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them. And he said to them, here am I. He said, go, I pray you, and see whether it be well with your brethren or well with the flocks, and bring word again. So that he sent them out to the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Well, back then, their flocks were so big, and God had blessed them so much that they couldn't stay in one area. They had to move from territory to territory to keep everything fed. And because there's just so many of the blessings that they had. In verse 15, and in verse 15 says, and a certain man found him, behold, he was wandering in the field, and the man asked him, saying, what do you seek? And he said, I seek my brethren, Tell me, I pray you, where they feed the flocks. And the man said, They have departed from here, for I have heard them say, Let us go to Dothan. And Joseph went after his brothers, and he found them in Dothan. Now, the brothers, let me just kind of paraphrase this so we don't go through word for word of everything, for time's sake. The brethren seen him coming. They said, Here comes this dreamer. They already hate him. They didn't want anything to do with him. And you know the story. They grab him, and they throw him into a well, or pit. I think the Bible said this hole. And so now, they talk about overnight what they want to do with him. So Reuben says, well, listen, it's not good that we kill him. Let's just take and sell him. So now they take the 20 pieces of silver. It's quite interesting, 20 pieces of silver, and Judas is 30 pieces of silver in the New Testament. So before they get a chance to go pull him out the pit, we'll pick up the story in verse 28. They're going to sell him. They are going to sell him to the Ishmaelites. However, somebody in the meantime sees him in the hole. So the Midianites, merchantmen, when they drew and they lifted up Joseph out of the pit, they sold him to the Midianites. So one way or the other, God was getting him to Egypt. Now, he didn't do nothing wrong to go there. He has no idea what's happening to him. You think he ever asked himself, man, what's going on? You think he might have ever asked himself, why am I going through this? Have you ever come to that stage in your life? Have you ever said, man, I don't know why I'm going through this? And you look for answers and you really don't know? Only to look back years later and say, now I know. Sometimes God's doing it simply to refine us. Other times he's doing it to accomplish his will in us. And so he gets us to the point where he can refine us, where he can put that spirit in us to use us. All right. Now, let's pick it up in verse where we were, 28. We'll pick it up in verse 29. So Reuben returns to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit. So he tore his clothes. He thought something happened to him. Maybe he was dead. So they faked his death. They took lamb's blood. They put it on his clothes, and they brought it back to the father and said, look, he's dead. And that's it. They think he's over. Now, let's go to chapter 39. Pick up the story in 39. Joseph's down in Egypt. It's amazing how quick the Bible changes stories. All right. We don't know how long he was down there. From the time he was sold till we pick it up in 39, we don't have a clear picture of time frame. So we don't know when we go through things in our life how clear and how quick things happen, how long it takes us. All right, so chapter 39, verse 1. So Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, the officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, brought him from the hands of the Ishmaelites, and had brought him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. The Ishmaelites bring him down there. He's sold to Potiphar, and all of a sudden, his life begins to change. Potiphar begins to change. All this is happening, and meanwhile, God's still with Joseph while he's going through this. I've heard people say, well, when a person goes through problems, they'll be so judgmental, well, you must have done something wrong. You've probably heard all that. Oh, you're going through that because you did something wrong. Well, not necessarily here. One thing was his character was being refined, but God was working out a plan. And sometimes that's as simple as it is in a person's life. God is working out a plan. Now look at verse 3. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord had made all that he did prosper in his hands. That's kind of like we read last week with Jacob and Laban, his father-in-law. Now, I didn't want to go there as far as time's sake, but that's what we covered last week. If you're doing what you're supposed to do, God will bless you. Those around you will be blessed because they bless you. Those around you will be cursed if they curse you. Right? The principles of God are clear. This man was being prosperous because he saw Joseph and he dealt well with Joseph. Now, we know the story of Joseph, that his wife, because he said he was a good-looking man, wanted to sleep with him. Joseph didn't break the character of God. He fled for his life when she went after him, left his clothes. Obvious-looking sin, right? Look, here he is, here's his clothes, in my bedroom. Now, what other conclusion can you come to? He must have went after that man's wife. He gets thrown in prison. Didn't do nothing wrong. He brought honor to the man's house because he fled. Now he's in prison. You think he might have asked himself again, man, how do I keep getting into this? Why is this happening to me? We ask that to ourselves. We just need to trust God. No matter what's happening, He's with you. And He will accomplish His task. If you're doing something wrong, then change it. Now, let's pick it up now with the story. I'm going to get past the falsely accused. The master puts him in prison. And I'm going to pick up the story now in verse, let's see, chapter 40. Yeah, let's pick it up in chapter 40, verse 1. Now he's in prison. Let's back up one verse. Let's back up one verse. I want to bring out a point here. Everywhere Joseph went, we see he didn't compromise in the truth of God. The principles he was taught, he still has. Verse 23, it says, the keeper of the prison looked not anything that was under all his hand, because the Lord was with him, talking about Joseph, that even the keeper of the prison now turns everything over to Joseph to be in charge of. So now we see Joseph prospering as a slave. Now we see Joseph prospering as a prisoner. And everybody around him, they're looking at Joseph, say, like, God's with this man. How do people outside us look at us inside? How do they look at us? Can they see God prospering us individually? If we're doing what God says to do, we should be that shining light. They should be saying, hey, I want to be a part of that people. That should be our example, that we should have a good report from those without, the Bible says. And now it's chapter 40, verse 1. So it came to pass after these things that the butler and the king of Egypt and his baker offended their lord the king, and Pharaoh was angry with those two officers against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers, and he put them into prison. And we know the story that these guys are put under Joseph, and Joseph takes care of these people. The dreams begin to set in, verse 9. So the chief butler told his dream to Joseph. These two men had a dream. Joseph hears the dream, and in his dream he says, behold, a vine was before me, and the vine, there were three branches, and it was as though it were budded, and her blossoms showed forth, and the clusters came forth, it ripe grapes. And the Pharaoh's cup, I'm trying to read this because they have almost no light up here now. Without those lights on the side. And Joseph said unto him, this is the interpretation of it. The three branches are 3 days, and yet in 3 days all the Pharaohs will lift up your head and restore you to the place, and you shall deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hands in the former manner which you were. Now, we know the story came to pass. But then he tells the guy, but think on me when this comes to pass. Don't forget me. I told you this. In other words, get me out of here. I'm in prison. Sure enough, it came to pass. We know the story of the baker. He had the same dream. 3 days, he's dead. They hung him. And so that one didn't go well. Chapter 41. 2 years later, 2 more years transpires that he's still in prison. You think he might have asked, why am I going through this? I'm sure it had to cross his mind once in a while. 2 more years comes to pass. We know the story of Pharaoh and the dreams. The 7 years of lean and the 7 years of plenteous. Look what he says. I want to talk about just real quick, like in this chapter. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, verse 16, it is not in me. In other words, he wants to know the dream. The person he revealed the dream to remembers him. He comes back. That person tells the Pharaoh, look, I was in prison. This guy told me the dream. It all came to pass. He might be able to help you. Joseph could have come in and said, yeah, I know dreams. I could do that. You know, he could have made himself look good getting out of prison. But you see, there's a humbleness in here. He had dreams as a child. He went around talking about, hey, I got this dream. Look, y'all going to bow down to me. Now he's coming out and he says, look, it's not me who has these dreams. It's God who reveals this stuff. You see, there's a little bit of a change in the way it's written that we can interpret. There must be a change in his character. And I would think after all this time in prison and being sold as a slave, it probably changed his character a little bit. There was a lot of humility at this point in his life. He says, Pharaoh, it is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer. Notice, and that's what happened. So he goes and he reveals it to God. In Joseph, verse 25, said to Pharaoh, the dream that Pharaoh is one, and that God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. See, Joseph was very careful in the wording of how he approached this at this particular time. He had been through a lot, and he certainly didn't want to offend his God. He knew that if he was going to do something, it had to be that God had to be glorified. He had the opportunity here to show the character, said, yep, I can interpret dreams. You know, I talked to somebody on the phone just not too long ago, and he calls up and says, look, I'm a prophet. Okay. How do you know you're a prophet? Yeah, well, he goes on explaining them. And I said, well, I can't say you are or you're not. I don't know you. You know, I said, well, all you do is see if you prophesy something, if it comes to pass or not. So I don't know. You know, there you just left a message on the phone. Someone call him up, say, I'm a prophet. Okay. How do I know? You know, I've learned through experience. I'm just not going to say, no, you're not. I don't even know the man. That's between them and God. It's not for me to say. What I'm saying here is that if God's used you in the past to do something, if you come back and say, I can do that, chances are God's not going to use you next time. You see, so Joseph was careful. His character was refined so that when God used him, Joseph knew it had to come from God. It couldn't come from him. The glory had to go to God. And even the way he says it now, he says, God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. That's the point I want to bring out, not the story of the 7 years of lean and 7 years of plenty. We know that. But I do want to ask you a question about that. Knowing that it's coming, what have you been doing to prepare? What have you been doing to prepare for your 7 years of lean? Is your house in order? Or your bills paid for? Have you got out of debt? Or you're living within your means? Is your character being refined that you give glory to God so that he can bless you later on and use you? Preparing for the 7 years of lean is more than just financial. It's spiritual. You and I have a job that's coming. There's going to be 7 years of lean. This world is going into a depression it has never seen before. Either that or the Bible's lying to us. I believe it's not lying to us. That means that you and I need to be prepared in every way, shape, and form to trust God. And if he has to take away whatever you have, he will get you prepared, or you will be out. And I don't mean out the church here. I mean out his kingdom, if he's called you to be a part. And that's why we're working feverishly to bring things in order, so that God can bless the household here, that he can bless your households, that he can bless you individually, so that he can use you like he was using Joseph. Because the 7 years of lean are almost on our doors if they're not already here. Because the economy, I don't care what the stock market says, a bunch of greedy vultures in the stock market. I'm sorry, they are. They don't care what happens to the economy as long as they're making money. And they will sell you out quick to get the buck. So I hope we realize that. And I keep telling them, don't get sucked into this. Be ready. If you got your 401ks and you got your money back or a lot of it back, get ready to move it quick. Because the next time it will happen fast and there won't be no recovery. You will not get what you had. All right, so let's move on. I'm almost out of time. Let's go to chapter 41. Chapter 41. No, I'm going to go to chapter 45. Chapter 45. Then I'm going to come back to chapter 42. Just a second. Joseph said to his brethren, remember the 7 years of lean begins to hit? We know the 7 years of plenty He told Pharaoh what was going on. Pharaoh put him in charge of everything. Everything was given to Joseph. What do you think God put him through those trials? Joseph had to be able to deal with this position in a way that he would not fail. The only way to know that he's not going to fail is go through the trials before you get there. He had to focus on what was important in his life. He began to have the riches with Potiphar. He had the lack in prison. And he knew how to trust God by that time. So that God put him in this position, he was the second most powerful person on the face of the earth. Those dreams begun to come to pass now that everybody's starting to bow down to Joseph. The sun, the moon, and everything was down to that 7 years of lean. His family began to bow down. And Joseph had to remain focused on God and balance out that it wasn't important anymore that he was the most powerful person under Pharaoh or the wealthiest man under Pharaoh. Imagine being the most powerful. You're a Bill Gates. In fact, he wasn't even near as powerful as Joseph was at that time. But to be able to serve God in that position. Joseph had to be able to be tried to be put into that. You and I, at an end-time tribulation, to serve those people out there will cost you. You will have to be counted and be tried so that when God uses you, you can bring glory to God. I've been telling people about this TV show we're trying to work on. I think the only way that God will bless that is if we can remain focused to give God the glory. To reach this generation with the method that God has used for today. Otherwise, we will miss the mark and we will be useless. And I believe He's going to help us. If we can focus on putting Him first and trust Him, I believe we'll be blessed. When we put out the tapes, the 2 seeds, our mailing list in less than 2.5 to 3 months would have doubled if we could afford to put everybody on the mailing list. I'm telling you, doubled in just 2.5 months. I believe we're on the right path. If we can just focus on how God wants us to be, that He will be glorified and we can grow the work and reach more and more people. Now Joseph's brothers come back to him. We're in Genesis chapter 45. We begin reading in verse 5. Now therefore be not grieved nor angry. His brothers sold him. He was a captive. He was a prisoner. And now he's the second most powerful man on the earth at the time. His brothers come to him. We see in chapters 42, chapter 43, verses 1 and 2. I won't go back there because of time. That they had to go buy food from him. They had to go face the loss and go back down to Egypt. Joseph, they realized that his brothers, that he's there. He says, therefore, be not grieved nor angry with yourselves that you sold me here, for God did send me before you to preserve life. By that time, Joseph understood what God had in store for him. He finally was able to answer the question, why am I going through this? When he saw his brothers, he said, God has sent me here to preserve life. Why Joseph now? Following the last great generation on Satan's Most Wanted? Because you and I have been called to preserve life. If we can't develop the character of a Joseph, then God won't be able to use us to preserve life. What special task does God have for you? The future will tell you.